Before we begin, I need you to understand something. What you are about to hear is not a legend. It is not a myth. It is a documented account written by ancient historians of a man who spent 17 days dying in a way that no modern legal system would even be able to put into words. He was not a criminal. He was not a traitor. He was a soldier who did his job too well and then made one mistake at a dinner table. That mistake cost him everything. Stay with me, because this story does not start with the punishment. It starts with a battle, a javelin, and a king who could not afford to share his glory with anyone. October 401 BC, the desert plains of Mesopotamia. The air is thick with dust and heat so heavy it presses against your chest like a physical weight. And to the west, the Euphrates moves slowly, ancient, wide, completely indifferent to the fact that two brothers are about to try to kill each other on its banks. On one side stands Artaxerxes II, king of kings, ruler of the Persian Empire, the largest empire the world had ever seen, stretching from Egypt in the west to the edges of India in the east, an empire of millions governed by one man's absolute will. On the other side stands his younger brother, Cyrus, 22 years old, brilliant, ruthless, and completely convinced that the throne his brother sat on was rightfully his. Now, before we go any further, you need to understand who Cyrus the Younger actually was, because this was not a desperate younger brother throwing a tantrum. This was one of the most capable military minds of his generation. He had spent years carefully, quietly, and methodically preparing to take the throne. He recruited roughly 14,000 Greek mercenaries, not conscripts, not volunteers, but professional soldiers, the finest fighting force the ancient world had to offer, men who had spent their lives at war and had no illusions about what war actually was. Among them was a soldier named Mithridates, who would survive what happened next and write about it in one of the most remarkable military memoirs in human history. Cyrus trusted these men completely. He had paid for them, trained alongside them, and built his entire strategy around them. What he had not fully accounted for was his brother's patience, because while Cyrus was building his army, Artaxerxes was counting, and when the two forces finally met on the plains of Cunaxa, the numbers told the story before the first sword was drawn, roughly 14,000 on one side and as many as 40,000 on the other. Before I go further, if you are new here, this channel is called Dark Past, and every single upload goes into the corners of history that classrooms skip, the brutal stories, the forgotten ones, the ones that force you to ask questions about power and human nature that do not have comfortable answers. If that is the kind of history you are looking for, subscribe right now. It takes 2 seconds, it costs you nothing, and you will never miss another story. Now back to the plains of Cunaxa, where a battle that should have been straightforward is about to take a turn that nobody predicted. The Greek mercenaries fought brilliantly. On their section of the battlefield, they broke through and routed the Persian left flank entirely. They were winning their part of the engagement by a significant margin. But Cyrus was not watching his Greeks win. He was watching his brother. And something happened inside him in that moment that ancient historians recorded but struggled to explain. A shift, a decision, a calculation that may not have been a calculation at all, but pure, overwhelming emotion taking the wheel. Cyrus looked across that battlefield, saw Artaxerxes, and charged directly at him. Not with his full force, not with a coordinated assault, but a personal charge, 22 years old, riding at full speed, straight toward the King of Kings in the middle of a battlefield of tens of thousands of men. It was either the bravest thing anyone had ever done, or the most catastrophically reckless, and depending on which ancient source you read, it was probably both. He got close. Some sources say he actually managed to wound Artaxerxes before the tide turned. But then a single javelin, launched through the dust and noise and chaos of that battlefield, found Cyrus the Younger and ended him instantly. The rebellion collapsed almost immediately. The mercenaries, suddenly leaderless in the middle of hostile Persian territory, began the long, desperate march home that Xenophon would later immortalize in writing, one of the greatest survival stories of the ancient world. But that story belongs to the man who threw that javelin. His name was Mithridates, and in the immediate aftermath of that battle, he was the most celebrated soldier in the entire Persian Empire. The problem was that his king could not allow anyone to know it. Artaxerxes rewarded Mithridates well: gold, honor, status, access to the court. By every visible measure, the man was being treated as a hero. But underneath that generosity was a threat that had been made with absolute clarity. Persian royal power was never purely military or political, it was theological. The king was not just a ruler, he was a cosmic figure, chosen by the god Ahura Mazda to maintain order in the world. His authority depended not just on his army, but on his image, and that image required him to be seen as the supreme force in every situation, including this one. Artaxerxes had already declared, publicly and officially, that it was he who struck down the rebel Cyrus with his own hand. The story was already circulating through the empire, and Mithridates, who knew exactly what had really happened, was told in terms that left no room for interpretation. You will never speak of this, you will never claim this kill, and if you do, what follows will be something you cannot imagine. For years, Mithridates held his silence. He accepted the gold, accepted the praise, smiled at court, and kept the truth locked somewhere behind his eyes. And then came the feast, and the wine, and the moment a man's pride proved stronger than his fear. Persian court banquets were legendary. Extraordinary food, rivers of wine, music, and the constant performance of power that defined life at the top of the ancient world. They were also, like every gathering of powerful men throughout all of human history, places where wine loosened what discipline had tightened, and where pride had a way of speaking before wisdom could stop it. Mithridates had been carrying his secret for years by this point. He had sat in rooms where Artaxerxes was praised for something Mithridates had done with his own hand. He had nodded, stayed quiet, and swallowed it. But that night, surrounded by soldiers who had been there, men who knew the truth the same way he did, the wine did what wine does. He spoke. He said it directly and without hesitation, that it was he, Mithridates, who killed Cyrus the Younger. Not the king. Him. His javelin. His throw. His moment. In a different empire, at a different table, that might have been nothing more than a soldier's boast that everyone forgot by morning. But this was Persia, and what Mithridates had just done, in front of witnesses, was call the King of Kings a liar. The report reached Artaxerxes. The sentence came back without delay. And the method chosen for the execution of Mithridates was one designed not merely to kill him, but to destroy him in a way that would make every person who heard about it understand exactly what it meant to publicly humiliate the King of Kings. The method was called Scaphism. The word Scaphism is derived from the Greek word for boat, and the reason for that name becomes clear the moment you understand the method. Two wooden boats were constructed, hollowed troughs fitted together like a clamshell, built precisely for this single purpose. Mithridates was brought forward, stripped, and placed inside the lower boat on his back. The upper boat was fitted over him like a lid, with holes cut to allow his head, his hands, and his feet to protrude into the open air. Everything else was sealed inside. He could not sit up. He could not turn. He could not shift his weight in any direction. He was fixed in place, a body inside a box, with only his extremities exposed to the world outside. Then the feeding began. A thick mixture of milk and honey was forced down his throat, not a small amount given once, but a deliberate and sustained overfeeding that continued until his digestive system began to break down under the pressure. The mixture produced violent nausea, severe diarrhea, and extreme bloating as his body struggled and failed to process what was being forced into it. Then, when the internal feeding was done, the same mixture was poured over everything exposed, his face, his hands, his feet, coating his skin in sweetness and leaving it to bake under the open Persian sun. The insects came almost immediately. Flies, wasps, bees, mosquitoes, drawn to the sugar on his skin, landing on his face and crawling into his eyes, his nose, his mouth, finding every opening and claiming it. And this was not done once. This was done every single day, without exception, because the entire purpose of Scaphism was not to execute a man, but to keep him alive while the world consumed him. I want to pause here because I think it is important to say this clearly. What we are describing is not the act of a monster acting alone in the dark. This was an official state punishment, ordered by a king, designed by someone, built by craftsmen, and administered by soldiers every single day for over 2 weeks. This was institutional. This was a system. If this kind of unflinching historical analysis matters to you, share this video with one person who needs to hear it. One share is genuinely how independent history channels like this one stay alive. Now, day 1 has become day 5. Day 5 is becoming day 10. And inside those boats, something is happening that goes beyond anything the human body was built to endure. Because Mithridates could not move, everything his body produced stayed beneath him. The sealed interior of those 2 boats became a chamber that combined heat, bodily waste, milk and honey, and the slow creep of rot into something that functioned as a perfect incubator. Plutarch, the Greek historian, whose account is one of our primary sources for this story, describes the result as creeping things and vermin emerging from the corruption inside the boats. Blowflies located the wounds on his exposed skin and laid eggs in them. Maggots hatched and began feeding on living tissue. Ants and beetles followed, drawn to warmth and decay. And because Mithridates was being kept alive through daily forced feeding, his body kept generating heat, kept producing waste, kept sustaining the very environment that was eating him from the inside out. Bacteria spread through his bloodstream unchecked. The chronicler John Zonaras describes his abdomen as becoming grotesquely distended, swelling by infection, by gas, by the relentless pressure of a body being pushed past every limit of endurance. Sepsis moved through him slowly and completely. For 17 days this continued. When the upper boat was finally removed on the 17th day, what Plutarch describes finding is not a man. It is what remains when a man has been methodically consumed. Mithridates was dead, not from a blade, not from thirst, not from starvation, but from a punishment so precisely engineered that it took more than 2 weeks to complete its work. Some historians have questioned whether Scaphism happened exactly as it is described, and that skepticism is legitimate. Plutarch and Ctesias, our main sources, were writing centuries after the events they describe, and Greek writers of that era had a documented tendency to amplify the cruelty of Persian power as a way of asserting the moral superiority of their own civilization. There is no archaeological confirmation, no carvings, no inscriptions, no physical evidence that this specific method was ever used. So it is entirely possible that the account was exaggerated, or that certain details were added over time by writers working from second-hand sources. But here is the thing that skepticism cannot touch. The political situation was real. Mithridates was real. The Battle of Cunaxa was real, and the Persian court's appetite for punishments that were as theatrical as they were lethal is well documented across multiple independent sources. Whether Scaphism happened exactly as described or in some modified form, the story encodes a truth about power that holds regardless of the specific details. And that truth is this: there are moments in history when those in power decide that a simple death is not enough, that what is required is not just the end of a life, but the destruction of everything that life represented, made visible and prolonged and public, so that every person who hears about it understands precisely what the cost of defiance looks like. That is what Scaphism was. Not an execution, a message, written in 17 days of suffering, so that no one who heard about it would ever forget it. And you haven't, have you? Thousands of years later, sitting wherever you are right now, you have not forgotten it either. That is exactly what Artaxerxes intended. Mithridates threw a javelin on a battlefield in 401 BC and changed the course of Persian history. He was rewarded for it. He was silenced for it. He held that silence for years, longer than most men could have managed, carrying the knowledge of what he had done while someone else received the credit. And then one night, at a table, surrounded by men who already knew the truth, he said out loud what everyone in that room already knew. He told the truth, and the Persian Empire spent 17 days erasing him for it. Not because he lied, not because he was dangerous, but because the truth he told was inconvenient to a man with absolute power. And absolute power does not negotiate with inconvenience, it eliminates it. History is full of those moments, and most of them are buried. A man or a woman who said something true at the wrong time to the wrong people and paid a price that no reasonable mind can justify. That is what this channel exists to unbury. Not to horrify you, though sometimes the truth is horrifying, but to make sure that the people history tried to erase are remembered. Mithridates threw that javelin. It was his, and now you know it. If you made it to the end of this video, you are exactly the kind of person this channel was built for. Most people tap out. You didn't. So here is what I am asking you to do. Subscribe if you have not already, because the next story is already being written and you do not want to miss it. Leave a comment below and tell me which dark chapter of history you want me to open next, because the most requested topic becomes the next upload. And share this with one person, just one, who you think needs to know this story. This is Dark Past. The past is never dead. It is only waiting for someone willing to remember it.